The bells were the first thing you heard, 3 of them, small and silver, stitched to the points of a fool's cap, and they rang with every turn of a head, every bow, every careful step across the cold stone floor of a great hall that had seen better kings than this one. The sound was light, almost cheerful, and if you did not know what it meant to wear them, you might even call it beautiful. It is the year 1340-something. The exact year does not matter, because this story happened in every year, in every kingdom, from Paris to Prague to the cold, wet castles of England. The fire in the hearth is enormous, meant to warm a room too large to be warmed, and it manages only to cast half the hall in orange light and leave the other half to shadow. At the far end of the room, a man with a painted face is performing. He is spinning a wooden plate on a stick. He is singing a song that everyone has already heard. He is watching the king's eyes. Go ahead and adjust your pillow. You are going to want to be comfortable for this part, because what happens in the king's eyes in these next few seconds will determine whether the man with the bells goes home tonight or does not go home at all. The king's expression shifts. The corners of his mouth, dry, slightly cracked from too much winter wine, begin to move, and then the sound comes, low and sudden and real, the laugh of a man who is rarely surprised, and the whole hall exhales at once. 100 courtiers, all of them pretending not to have been watching, begin to smile in unison. The danger has passed. The room relaxes into warmth. The jester bows. The bells ring. And somewhere behind his painted smile, the man whose name history will not bother to remember takes a long, slow breath that no one in the room is allowed to see. This is the job, not the spinning plate, not the song. The job is the breath, controlled and quiet and invisible, the management of the space between a joke and a king's reaction, which is the most dangerous space in the medieval world. Wider than a battlefield, more treacherous than any sea, because a battlefield at least has the decency to announce itself. The space between a joke and a royal laugh announces nothing at all. He had been doing this since he was 7 years old. He would do it until his knees gave out, or his memory failed, or the king grew tired of him, whichever came first. And on this particular evening, in this particular hall, with the fire behind him throwing his enormous shadow up against the wall like something monstrous and magnificent at once, he had no way of knowing which of those endings was already on its way. His name was Thomas. At least that is what the record says. A single line in a monastery ledger from somewhere in the English Midlands, written by a monk who clearly considered the entry beneath him. Thomas, son of a rope maker, given to the household of Lord Aldrich as entertainment, age 7, given, as though he were a piece of furniture, as though a child could be handed from one room to another and expected to simply fit wherever he was placed. The village Thomas came from had no name worth recording either. It was the kind of place that existed between other places. A cluster of low houses with thatched roofs going grey at the edges, a single well, a market that arrived once a month and smelled of wet animal and wood smoke. His father made rope. His mother made bread when there was flour and made do when there was not. They had 6 children, which was considered normal, and enough food for 4, which was also considered normal. Thomas was the second youngest. He was also from the very beginning funny. Not funny the way children are accidentally funny, not the stumbling, gap-toothed comedy of small people discovering a world too large for them. Thomas was funny the way a knife is sharp, deliberately precisely, in a way that made adults feel as though they had been cut before they noticed the blade. He could mimic the village priest's walk so perfectly that even the priest's wife had to look away to hide her smile. He could make a story out of nothing, a dog crossing a road, a cart stuck in mud, and hold a room of tired, hungry people in perfect silence for 10 minutes. He was 7 years old. Settle in, because this is the part of the story where what looks like luck reveals itself to be something considerably more complicated than that. Lord Aldrich came through the village on his way to somewhere more important, and he stopped as powerful men always stop, because something amused him. Thomas was performing in the road. No audience in particular, no occasion, simply performing the way some children run or climb, because stillness was not available to him. Aldrich watched for perhaps 3 minutes. Then he spoke to Thomas's father. Then money changed hands. Thomas did not cry. He was old enough to understand that his family needed the coins more than they needed him, and this understanding sat inside his chest, not as cruelty, but as simple fact, the way cold sits inside stone in winter. He picked up nothing. He had nothing to pick up. He walked beside Aldrich's horse for 6 miles without speaking, listening to the bells the horse's bridle made when it moved, and thinking already about what might make the Lord laugh before bedtime. He had never lived in a castle before. He had never slept in a room with a door that closed. He would never quite stop being amazed by either. There was a word they used in the French courts, license, and it meant, in theory, that the jester was free to mock the bishop's vanity, free to imitate the chancellor's limp, free to say, wrapped in the soft cloth of a joke, the things that everyone in the room was already thinking but would sooner swallow glass than speak aloud. It was a beautiful word. It sounded, if you said it quickly and did not think too hard, almost like liberty. It was not liberty. It was not liberty. It was a leash made of laughter, and the jester held one end, and the king held the other. And the only question that mattered, the question Thomas learned to answer before he learned anything else, was how much slack the king was willing to allow on any given day. The rules were never written down. Written rules are for people who expect to be fairly judged, and no jester in the history of any court ever expected that. Instead, the rules lived in the air of the room, in the temperature of the king's mood, in the particular way a lord held his wine cup when he was already thinking about something else. Thomas learned to read these signs the way sailors read water, not from instruction, but from the understanding that failure to read them correctly meant drowning. Rule 1: the joke must always appear to be about someone other than the king. It could be about the king. It could be about the king. It could be aimed at the king with the precision of an arrow, but it must wear the costume of being about someone else, and the king must be allowed to believe, if he wished, that he was laughing at a different man entirely. Pull the blanket a little closer, because Rule 2 is the one that kept Thomas awake at night, staring at the ceiling of whatever room they gave him, which was never quite a servant's room, and never quite a gentleman's room, and therefore was always precisely no room at all. Rule 2: the jester must know when to stop, not when the joke was finished, not when the audience had laughed, when the king had laughed enough, which was a different and entirely unmeasurable thing, a quant, it that changed without announcement and left no visible mark on its way, in or out. Too little, and the fool seemed timid. A disappointment, a man not worth his bells. Too much, and the fool became dangerous. And a dangerous fool was not kept. A dangerous fool was dealt with in ways that the monastery ledgers recorded only in the vaguest possible language. Thomas had watched it happen to another man before he was 9 years old, a jester named Edmund, who was funnier than Thomas and knew it, and who had pushed one joke 3 words past the place where it should have ended. There was a king, and the name does not matter because this king wore 100 names across 100 courts across several centuries, who was taxing his people into starvation. Not unusual, not even particularly remarkable by the standards of the age. But the people knew it, and the lords knew it, and the bishops knew it, and every single one of them smiled at the king's table and said nothing, because saying something was the kind of decision that ended dynasties and careers, and more immediately lives. The jester knew it too. His name in this particular telling was Rodrigo, and he served at a court in the south of France in the early 14th century, in a hall that smelled permanently of tallow candles and damp stone and the particular anxiety of men who had things to lose. Rodrigo was not young anymore. He had been performing for 23 years. His knees ached in winter. His best material was 20 years old, and the court had heard all of it, which meant he was in the slow, quiet danger that comes not from saying too much, but from becoming invisible. He needed something new, and so he did what the best of them always did. He built a joke that was not a joke at all. He built a weapon and disguised it as entertainment, the way you might hide a knife inside a loaf of bread, and he would waited for the right evening. The evening came in November, after the harvest reports had arrived and been quietly buried by the Chancellor, and the king was in good spirits because he did not yet know what the reports contained. Rodrigo stood before the fire and told a story about a farmer. A fictional farmer, a ridiculous farmer, a farmer so comically hapless that the court was already laughing before the point arrived. The farmer, Rodrigo explained with enormous innocence, had given so much of his grain to his lord that he had nothing left to feed his children, and so he went to his lord and asked what the children should eat. And the lord said, "Let them eat the taxes back." The room went very still, and then the king laughed. A real laugh, surprised out of him, the kind that arrives before the mind can examine whether it should. And because the king laughed, everyone laughed, and because everyone laughed, and because everyone laughed, the joke was safe, and because the joke was safe, the thing inside it, the accusation, the truth, the small sharp blade, had already entered the room and could not be taken back out. 3 weeks later, without explanation or announcement, the tax rate was quietly reduced. Rodrigo never mentioned it. He understood, the way all the great ones understood, that the power of the joke lived entirely in its deniability. The moment you claimed credit for the knife, you had already confessed to carrying it. He went on performing. His knees still ached. There is a particular kind of mourning that exists only in old castles, in the hour just before the household wakes, when the fire has burned down to orange memory, and the rushes on the floor hold the cold smell of the night before, and a man can sit alone in a great hall that was full of people 7 hours ago and feel, with absolute clarity, how completely alone he actually is. Thomas knew this morning well. He had been living inside it in one form or another for 30 years. He was the king's favourite, had been for nearly a decade, which was longer than most favourites lasted, and long enough that he had made the mistake of believing it meant something permanent. The king called for him by name. The king saved him pieces of meat from the royal table, a gesture so unusual that the other servants noticed and resented it with the quiet, focused intensity of people who have very little and are watching someone else receive more. The king laughed at his jokes, even when they were not very good, which is the most intoxicating thing a powerful man can do for the person who entertains him, because it feels indistinguishable from love. It was not love. Thomas knew this, the way you know a thing you have decided not to examine too closely, keeping it in the peripheral vision of your understanding where it cannot quite resolve into its true shape. The sign, when it came, was not dramatic. It was never dramatic. A favourite does not fall. Falling implies a single moment, a clean break, an event you can point to afterward and say, "There, that is where it happened." A favourite simply becomes slightly less necessary. The way a word you have used too often begins to lose its meaning, not all at once, but gradually syllable by syllable, until one morning you say it, and it sounds like nothing at all. The king began requesting another man. His name was Peter, younger than Thomas by 15 years, with a sharper face and newer material and the particular energy of someone who has not yet learned to be afraid. Thomas watched Peter perform from the side of the hall and felt something he could not quite name, something that lived in the chest just below the sternum, warm and heavy and not entirely unlike grief. He was not dismissed. Nobody was ever simply dismissed. Dismissal was a mercy the powerful rarely bothered to extend, because ignoring a man was so much easier and cost nothing at all. Thomas simply found that the king stopped calling his name. The good seat at the table migrated, gradually, down toward the colder end. The pieces of meat stopped arriving. He went on performing. He told his old jokes to smaller rooms, to lesser lords, to audiences who laughed politely and then forgot him before the evening was over. Outside, the seasons continued their indifferent work. Inside, Thomas adjusted the way water adjusts to whatever shape it is poured into, without complaint, without ceremony, without anyone in the room noticing the change at all. His name was Wolsey, not the Cardinal, a different Wolsey entirely, a smaller and considerably less fortunate one, and he served at the court of a minor English lord in the late 13th century, whose name history has also declined to preserve, which is perhaps the only kindness history extended to either of them. Wolsey was, by every account that survives, which is to say by the single account that survives, a genuinely extraordinary performer. The account is a letter written by a visiting cleric to his brother, and it describes Wolsey in the kind of language men of the cloth reserved for things they found simultaneously impressive and theologically troubling. He was, the cleric wrote, the sort of man who made you forget, briefly and completely, that you were unhappy. This is the highest thing you can say about a jester. It is also, as Wolsey would discover, a description that contains its own danger, because a man who can make you forget your unhappiness has by definition located the exact place where your unhappiness lives. And knowing where a powerful man keeps his unhappiness is like knowing where he keeps his gold. Useful, yes, but the kind of useful that attracts a particular kind of consequence. Take one slow breath. We are about to go somewhere uncomfortable, though we will go there quietly, and you will not need to look away. The joke Wolsey told on the evening of the 14th of March, the cleric records the date with the precision of a man documenting a small disaster, was about inheritance. Specifically, it was about a lord who had 3 sons and left his estate to none of them, choosing instead to leave everything to his favourite hunting dog, on the grounds that the dog had never disappointed him. The court laughed. The lord laughed, and then someone, a cousin, the cleric thinks, a man with an old grievance and a sharp memory, leaned toward the lord and said something quietly into his ear. What was said is not recorded, but its effect is, the laughter stopped. Not gradually, the way laughter usually fades, but completely, the way a candle stops when you press your fingers around the flame. The Lord's expression moved through several countries in the space of a single second. Amusement, confusion, recollection, and then something that had no name but that everyone in the room recognized immediately, because everyone in the room had spent years learning to recognize it in order to be standing somewhere else when it arrived. Wolsey was still smiling. He had not yet understood that the joke was over. This is the moment the cleric dwells on, in his letter, with the particular attention of someone who cannot stop seeing it. Even weeks later, the jester's smile, still there, increasingly alone in the room, like a candle left burning in a house that everyone else has already left. The account ends there. The cleric does not say what happened next. He does not need to. Her name was Agnes, and she is the one history almost kept. There is a fragment, not a full account, not a letter, not even a complete sentence, only a fragment preserved in the margin of a French legal document from around 1320, written in a different hand than the document itself, as though someone could not help themselves, as though what they had witnessed was too specific to leave unrecorded and too dangerous to record anywhere more permanent than the edge of someone else's paperwork. The fragment says only this: La femme de war qui parlait comme une folle, mais savait comme un sage. The woman of the king, who spoke like a fool, but knew like a wise one. That is all. A single sentence in a margin. And yet here we are, 700 years later, still in the room with her. Women jesters were rare enough to be remarkable and common enough that their existence surprised no one. They occupied a category the medieval world had not quite decided how to name, which meant they were simultaneously more free and more precarious than their male counterparts, permitted things that men were not, and protected by precisely nothing. Agnes had been performing at the French court for 11 years. She was, by the time of the fragment, somewhere in her middle 30s, which, in the 14th century, carried a gravity that it does not carry now. She had outlasted 2 kings and 4 chief advisors, and 1 outbreak of something the court physicians called the winter sickness, and everyone else called what it was. She had survived by being useful, and on one particular evening in the winter of 1320, she chose to be useful in a different way than she ever had before. The king, young, recently crowned, already making the particular mistakes that young kings make when surrounded by older men with longer plans, had just announced a military campaign that everyone in the room understood would be catastrophic, and no one in the room was willing to say so. The advisers nodded. The lords nodded. The lords nodded. The bishops found pressing business in the middle distance. Agnes stepped forward. She too told a story about a shepherd boy who had decided to fight a bear, having never seen a bear, having only heard that bears were large and slow, and therefore probably manageable. The story was funny. It was also, with a precision that took the breath away, a description of exactly what was happening in the room at that moment. She finished. The silence that followed was a different kind of silence than Wolsey's silence. Not the silence of something ending, but the silence of something being understood. The king looked at her for a long time. Then he postponed the campaign. He never thanked her. Of course he never thanked her. Gratitude would have required acknowledging what she had done. And acknowledging what she had done would have required acknowledging that a woman in bells had seen more clearly than every man in the room. She knew this before she opened her mouth. There is a question that follows every jester through every account, every fragment, every marginal note that history bothered to preserve. And it is this: at what point does a man who performs madness begin to lose the boundary between the performance and himself? It is not a comfortable question. It is the kind that sits at the edge of the candlelight where you cannot quite see its face, and the longer you look at it, the less certain you become that you want to. The medieval world had a category for this. They called certain jesters naturals. Men and women who were not performing foolishness but simply were it, whose minds worked at an angle to the ordinary world in ways that made them genuinely unpredictable, genuinely strange, genuinely free from the social calculations that constrained everyone else. A natural could say anything because a natural did not fully understand consequence, and so kings kept them, not as performers exactly, but as something closer to oracles, creatures whose disorder was itself a kind of clarity whose broken compass pointed occasionally and accidentally at true north. His name was Patch, which was not his name, but the name they gave him, the way you name a cat or a dog, and he served Henry VIII of England in the early 16th century, and he was, by every account, genuinely not entirely present in the way that most people are present. He laughed at things that were not funny. He wept at things that were not sad. He once stood in the middle of a royal banquet and delivered at considerable length what appeared to be a sermon addressed to the food. The court found him hilarious. Henry found him soothing, which is a different and more revealing thing. Settle in now, because this is the part of the story that aches in a particular way, the way that only kindness observed from a distance can ache. There were men at that court, hard men, careful men, men who had survived the Tudor court by developing an almost architectural understanding of when to speak and when to become invisible, who were quietly, consistently, unremarkably kind to Patch. They made sure he ate. They steered him away from situations his fractured understanding could not navigate. They did not do this loudly or with any expectation of recognition. They simply did it, the way you do a thing that needs doing when you are the person who happens to be there. Nobody recorded their names. The historians were busy with Henry. But Patch remembered them. In whatever way Patch remembered anything, in whatever warm and sideways fashion his mind held the world, he remembered the men who made sure he ate. You could tell because he was always calmer near them, always slightly more present, as though their ordinary kindness was a kind of gravity that held him temporarily to the earth the rest of them inhabited. He lived longer than most jesters. He died in his sleep. Where there the mask ever fully came off, whether there was a self beneath the performance that was distinct and intact, and privately his own. This is the question nobody thought to ask him. This is the question nobody thought to ask any of them. The morning was ordinary. This is the thing that cannot be said. Enough. The morning was ordinary. This is the thing that cannot be said. the thing that history always forgets to mention because history is interested in what happened and almost never in what happened just before. The profound aching, unremarkable ordinariness of the last morning before everything changes. The bread was the same bread. The cold coming through the gap in the shutter was the same cold it had been all winter. The bells on the fool's cap, hanging on their hook by the door, caught the early light the same way they caught it, every morning, throwing 3 small circles of gold onto the opposite wall, like something almost holy. His name was Guillaume, and he served at the court of a Burgundian duke in the middle of the 15th century. And on this particular morning he was thinking about a new joke, not a dangerous joke. He had learned, over 22 years of careful survival, to leave dangerous jokes to younger men with less to lose and more to prove. This was a simple joke, a warm joke, the kind built around a misunderstanding between a miller and a priest, the kind of joke that asked nothing of its audience except a willingness to be briefly delighted. He was turning it over in his mind, the way a craftsman turns a piece of wood, looking for the grain, finding the place where it wanted to open. He ate his breakfast slowly. He had developed in middle age the habit of eating slowly, of tasting things, of refusing to let the small pleasures of a morning be consumed without attention. A bowl of something warm, a piece of bread that was, on this particular morning, better than usual, slightly softer, slightly warm, as though the kitchen had been paying attention. He noticed this. He was grateful for it in the quiet, wordless way you are grateful for small things when you have lived long enough to understand that small things are most of what there is. He straightened his costume. This took longer than it used to, the costume having acquired, over the years, a complexity of repairs and additions that made it less a garment and more a record, every patch a different court, every replaced bell a different king, the whole thing a kind of autobiography that only he could read. He checked the bells. All 3 present. All 3 voices still distinct, still themselves, the high one, the middle one, the low one that had a slight wobble in it that he had grown so accustomed to, he would have missed it had it ever been fixed. He did not know that the Duke had received a letter the previous evening. He did not know what the letter contained. He did not know that a decision had been made, quietly and without particular malice, in the way that decisions about unimportant people are always made, efficiently, without ceremony and without anyone in the room feeling especially troubled by it afterward. He picked up his cap. He put it on. The bells rang once, softly as they always did. He walked toward the great hall, thinking about the miller and the priest, turning the joke in his mind, finding the grain, finding the place where it wanted to open. It was a good joke. It deserved a proper telling. He was almost there. Everything ends. This is not a tragedy. It is simply the oldest fact there is, older than kingdoms, older than the idea of kings. There is simply the oldest fact there is, older than the idea of kings, older than the first person who discovered that making someone laugh was a way of making them, briefly and essentially, yours. The castles crumbled, the courts dissolved. The great halls that once rang with music and argument and the particular craft tension of a joke landing in a room full of powerful people became, over centuries, first ruins and then archaeology and then photographs in books that sit unread on shelves in universities, in cities that did not exist when the bells were ringing. And yet, there is a manuscript in a library in Bologna, small, unimportant, the kind of document that survives purely by accident because it happened to be shelved next to something someone else considered valuable, that contains, in its margins and between its lines, and once, magnificently, directly across the top of a page as though the writer could not wait to find proper space, a collection of jokes, not summaries of jokes, not descriptions, the jokes themselves written out in full in the handwriting of someone who clearly found them very funny, who could not help themselves, who needed to get them down before they were lost. The jokes are about a miller and a priest, about a dog who inherits an estate, about a shepherd boy who has decided to fight a bear, about a lord so cold that the frost follows him indoors out of professional courtesy. They are, not in the way that requires historical context or scholarly footnotes, but in the deep, simple, human way that has no period and no nationality and no requirement except a willingness to be briefly delighted. Someone told these jokes in a cold hall, wearing bells, watching a king's eyes. Someone built them out of nothing, out of timing and nerve, and the particular courage it takes to stand in front of power and say, wrapped in laughter, the thing that power does not want to hear. Someone carried them in their memory through courts and seasons and the long ordinary passages of years that leave no mark on any record anywhere, and then someone else heard them and laughed and thought, I cannot let this disappear, so they otote them down in a margin, in borrowed space, in the only kind of permanence available to people who are not themselves considered permanent. Thomas is in there, and Rodrigo, and Agnes with her shepherd boy and her bear, and Guillaume, still working on his miller and his priest, still finding the grain, still finding the place where it wants to open, and Patch calmer near the men who made sure he ate, and Woolsey still smiling, increasingly alone in the room, all of them in a margin, all of them preserved in someone else's borrowed space. Outside the library window, wherever that window is, whatever season it currently holds, the world continues its loud and urgent business. Inside, it is very quiet. The jokes are still there. They are still funny. That is enough. That has always been enough.